What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so Donny Cates is writing Doctor Strange right now, and it's amazing. Like it's absolutely amazing. The art's okay. The art could definitely be a little bit better, but the story is amazeballs. Okay, so this is nuts. Doctor Strange becomes God and then fights the god of death. That's basically what this is. And you guys are gonna be amazed to find out who it is. Okay, so initially this whole thing picks up with the character of Zelma meeting with an old man. Now, for those of you guys who have not been keeping up with Doctor Strange, Zelma was a chick who was introduced when Jason Aaron was writing Doctor Strange during All New, All Different Marvel. And Zelma was just a chick who kind of wandered into the home of Doctor Strange requesting help for the fact that she was basically infested by demons. And that led into the Empirical storyline. And the Empirical storyline was really like Jason Aaron's way of kind of bringing in the 1990s Doctor Strange stories. And what I mean by that is back in the 1960s, 1970s, there were no rules when it came to magic. So Doctor Strange could literally do anything he wanted to. Like if writers wanted him to do something, they would just invent a spell. It'd be like, well, Doctor Strange has a spell that allows him to do virtually anything he wants to. The problem with this was that it made it virtually impossible to tell compelling stories. It's like compelling stories with Silver Age Superman. How do you tell a good story about a character who can literally do anything? And so because of that, in 1992, in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme issues 48 through 49, I'm pretty sure, there was a story called Demon's Death. And what this basically did is it brought forth this idea that the Vishanti, where Doctor Strange gets a large brunt of his power, had called on him for a favor to basically help them fight a war. And Doctor Strange said no. And the result was that they stripped him of a huge amount of his power, and he was replaced with Brother Voodoo, I think it was. Eventually, Doctor Strange came back, but he came back with his power reduced, and it was a way for Marvel to kind of nerf his abilities. And so he went forward as a master of the mystic arts, kind of. And so from that point, up until the modern day, he's never been as powerful as he was back in the 1960s. That's why we refer to the original Doctor Strange back in the 60s and 70s as quote unquote classic Doctor Strange, and then you have modern Doctor Strange. They're basically the same character with two extremely different levels of power. But Jason Aaron had used the Empirical storyline to basically have this race of individuals who went through the entire, all these different dimensions in the main Marvel universe and were killing off magical artifacts and by extension, quote unquote, killing magic itself. And so what this did is it reduced the amount of magic that was in the Marvel universe by a pretty huge margin. Now, since the defeat of the Empirical, Doctor Strange has been kind of working his way back up, but it was kind of a restart more or less. It was a reboot for the Doctor Strange mythos more or less, where he was starting with smaller spells and then working his way up to higher levels of power. And so ever since then, Zelma has basically been an apprentice of sorts, and her ability to use magic has actually grown by a pretty huge margin. But this blind man kind of walks in there, or I guess really this old man kind of walks in there with her and is like, hey, look, like what in the world's going on? Where's the Sorcerer Supreme? And the response to Zelma is, well, Doctor Strange is gone. I don't really know where he is. And then the old man follows up with a second question. No, where's the real Sorcerer Supreme, Loki? And so basically this immediately picks up with the idea that Loki has replaced Doctor Strange. And so following this, it really kind of shifts over to the Bar with No Doors. Of course, the Bar with No Doors is basically invented by Jason Aaron, and it's a place where all these different magical wielders in the Marvel Universe congregate. The difference here is that Jason Aaron had kind of established this somewhat ambiguous rule that there is a price to be paid for magic. What that price is was never really solidified, never really set in stone. It was just, if you use too much magic, then you're gonna have to pay some kind of a price somewhere along the line. It's kind of weird, but it was a way to sort of curb the power of Doctor Strange and say, this is why he didn't routinely fix everything all the time, is because there were limits, there were rules, that if he used too much magic, a price would have to be paid. Now, the response to Loki here is that rule is stupid. It's a nonsensical rule. And it actually kind of works here. And the reason why is because in Marvel Comics, most magic wielders are mortals. If Scarlet Witch is walking down the road and Black Widow's pissed off because Scarlet Witch got with Hawkeye and Black Widow's angry because she really wanted Hawkeye, shoots Scarlet Witch with a sniper rifle, she's dead. That's the end of Scarlet Witch. But someone like Loki, he's a god. He's a god that basically is in possession of the powers of Doctor Strange. How he got Doctor Strange's powers, we don't know yet. But because of the fact that he's a god, he kind of comes along and says, look, okay, sure, maybe there's a price to be paid for wielding magic, but that price applies to you guys. It doesn't apply to me because your physical mortal forms can only tolerate so much pain, suffering, and then eventual death. Whereas I, as a god, am basically immortal so long as I eat the apples of Adun. So, that's it for Loki. And so from there, he's just kind of like, what I'm looking for is something called the Exile of Sing Soon. And it's kind of interesting because this is something we've never really heard of before. And the response of everybody is just kind of laughing at him and saying, this spell does, like, this spell, you'll never find it. Like, no one knows where this spell is. But Loki really responds by, one, just kind of, losing it, and two, actually like teleporting everybody out of the bar. Now, the other half of this, which is actually kind of interesting, is Loki is texting Zelma. He's like, hey, I kind of screwed up. No one's gonna help me out, and I'm gonna be late because now Thor's here. Because Jane Foster's here. I mean, this is kind of a funny situation, but Jane Foster being here is just kind of like, okay, Loki, you gotta stop your schemes, whatever. And it's kind of interesting because Loki's actually trying to be a good guy here. And the way he shows that is he says, there's actually frost giants who were invading Earth, who are working to invade Earth right now. I stopped them, but the reason why you didn't know is because they have a spell that hides them from the eyes of Heimdall. Otherwise, he would have told you something. But Heimdall couldn't see him. He didn't know they were there, and they're basically using dark magic in order to pull it off. And so it's Loki being a good guy. So of course, this sends Jane Foster on her way. And from there, we end up finding out that Doctor Strange is taking up residence as basically as a veterinarian with a dog named Bats that talks. But what ends up going on is there is a door inside the Sanctum Sanctorum of Doctor Strange that is always kept locked. And there's no spell that Loki or Zelma know and can find that will open the door, meaning Doctor Strange is the only one that knows how to open it. And so they're completely unable to access, what's on the other side of this wall. It's an interesting situation because Doctor Strange is kind of meandering around town, of course, talking to Bats. And then, Loki starts making the moves on Zelma. Now, this immediately sends Doctor Strange into a panic. And the reason why is because Zelma's currently holding back a bit of the knowledge she knows when it comes to magic. But if she divulges everything she knows, then that means that Loki will be privy to information that Doctor Strange didn't give him when he relinquished his position to Loki himself. And Loki will basically be in possession of like the full totality of Doctor Strange's powers. And so what you end up having is Stephen Strange, who shows up on the doorstep and says, look, we got to get out of here. Zelma freaks out because she's like, hey, look, like what in the world? It's kind of funny because Loki, Doctor Strange's like, hey man, you stole my girl. And Loki's like, no, you lost your girl. Like this definitely seems like something out of Jerry Springer. But the fact remains here that Doctor Strange gets wrecked pretty readily. And because of the fact that he's really not a match for Loki, because Loki's in the totality of all these powers, and Doctor Strange has a full, a few spells left to himself, what ends up happening is he's basically kind of forced to go about his way, but not before Bats dies. And the reason why is because Bats has a weak heart. And of course, Loki basically creates a spell that keeps Bats encased, and Bats' heart fails and Bats dies. And it's like the saddest thing ever. He's like, don't let anyone hurt your friends. It's like, no, Bats. Like, we didn't get to see him very long. We didn't get to spend a whole lot of time with Bats, but we had some great moments. I liked him. I enjoyed Bats. But this really kind of sends Doctor Strange off on like this grander plan, right? And that's one of the things that really came out of Jason Aaron's run with the Empirical, is you basically had this idea that Stephen Strange had to come to the realization that with there being so little magic out there in the world, he had to kind of get back to his roots, right? Because ever since he trained with the Ancient One, and ever since he became the new Sorcerer Supreme after the Ancient One died, it's always been magic solves everything. But once magic was kind of reduced, he really had to just kind of rely on his own personal resolve. And that's what's going on here. What he ends up doing is he ends up traveling out to a house in the middle of nowhere and seeks the help of a guy. And this guy says, I'm not helping you. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And of course, the response to Stephen Strange is, well, look, you got to help us anyway. And this guy's response is, but you know what happens when I try to do good things. When I try to do good things, bad things happen to everyone. And Stephen Strange's response is, yeah, but we fixed that. And so ultimately what ends up happening is this guy says, okay, fine, I'll work with you. And Stephen says, but I don't need you, Robert. What I need is the Sentry. So this is Robert Reynolds. The Sentry has returned. Like, I'm so excited about this. Man, I love the Sentry. And so because of this, what we end up finding out here is there was this great big huge tournament that was held, basically, that was held by the Vishanti, and the Vishanti had essentially kind of imposed this on Doctor Strange. And now the result of this was that Doctor Strange had kind of, won the tournament, but the Vishanti basically stripped him of his various spells at his disposal and said, we've selected a new Sorcerer Supreme. This new Sorcerer Supreme is Loki. And so because of this, like, basically Loki became the new Sorcerer Supreme because the Vishanti chose him to be the new Sorcerer Supreme. However, if that seems kind of silly and nonsensical to you, it does, because you're not getting the full story. So pick up with what's going on right now. You basically have this kind of being explained to Robert Reynolds by Doctor Strange. And it's kind of interesting because Robert Reynolds, the Sentry, of course, he really has those three personalities, right? The Sentry, the Void, and then Robert Reynolds himself. But the Sentry is just kind of like, look, I told you I would help. Let's go ahead and help. And what we end up finding out is that Doctor Strange is actually leading Sentry to the House of Wong. And it's kind of funny here. It's this funny encounter, right? He's like, hey, Wong, you got to help. And Wong is basically answering the questions of Doctor Strange before Doctor Strange really finishes asking the questions. And it's funny because Sentry's response is, wow, man, you guys have a real rapport. Like, it must be because you guys fought together for so long, and because you guys are you guys have this magical bond. And, and Strange is like, actually, I texted him. And Wong's like, yeah, and he emailed, and he called, and he would not leave me alone. But ultimately, Wong basically says to Stephen Strange, look, I understand what you want to do here, but what you're looking to do is not something that you can just walk in and achieve, because you're talking about an extreme level of power. Now remember, Wong is very, very experienced. He's seen everything Doctor Strange has done. He was a tutor for a bit for Doctor Strange in his early days. But like, Wong is wildly experienced here. He's just not the Sorcerer Supreme at the moment. And so Wong has a lot of pearls of wisdom to offer, and he's very familiar with these various dimensions that are out there. And so what we end up finding out is that the plan of Doctor Strange is to travel to Asgard. And this is actually something that we've never seen before. Not so much Strange traveling to Asgard, but what he does while he's here. Of course, what he's looking to do is to basically find Odin, right? Like basically speak directly with Odin and to, essentially ask a particular request. The problem with this is that, remember, the War of Realms in the Thor God of Thunder storyline is going on, which means that at this moment, the time this story is being written, Freya is on her, seems to be on her deathbed, and Odin is tending to her side. And the result is that Odin's brother Cole is basically steward of Asgard. He's the one that's ruling in the stead of Odin himself. And of course, Cole is very, very hardcore, right? He's just like, no outsiders allowed. Now, of course, Doctor Strange got here by hiding himself, from Heimdall. But the fact remains here that where Cole and everyone is just kind of like, look, we're not going to let you do this is when the Sentry is invoked. And it's kind of interesting because this is not the first time we've seen this, right? Like, if you're not really familiar with Marvel Comics, on the surface, you would be like, okay, no way the Sentry would be able to hold his own against Asgardians. Actually, he would. We saw that in Siege on Asgard, right? Like in the events of Siege on Asgard, when Norman Osborn was director of S.H.I.E.L.D., he grabbed the Sentry, Robert Reynolds, basically swindled him to his side, and then Robert Reynolds destroyed the entirety of Asgard and Broxton, Oklahoma. And so because of this, like, Robert Reynolds is an exceedingly powerful character. Now, his powers wax and wane based on the story that a writer is telling at any one point in time. So while you see him facing off against Asgardians and holding them off with the greatest of ease, you may see him struggle against Asgardians by a different writer because that's what the story calls for. So again, it really kind of bounces around. But the idea of Doctor Strange is actually to travel to the World Tree of Yggdrasil and to basically gain all of its power. Now again, this is not something that we see very often. In fact, we've never really seen this. We've never seen anyone ever harness the power of Yggdrasil. The closest we got was when Thor, when Thor, Odin's son, gained the powers, or I guess really, gained access to the runes, and by doing so became Rune King Thor and was basically God mode. But aside from that, like, that's about the extent of it. But ultimately, like, Doctor Strange essentially sacrifices the body of bats to Yggdrasil, and then like Yggdrasil itself snatches up Doctor Strange and imbues him with 100% of its power. And so Doctor Strange in turn like travels back to Earth and faces off against Loki. Now, this is kind of cool because this is when Doctor Strange becomes insanely powerful, right? Like, the way this story is written by Donny Cates, Doctor Strange is saying things like, I've never had this level of power before. I'm way beyond anything I've ever been before, i.e. he's way beyond classic Doctor Strange. I would say this is probably Doctor Strange's most powerful form. And so from there, what he ends up doing is traveling directly and facing off against Loki to basically bring down his existence as Sorcerer Supreme and reclaim the mantle for himself. Now, of course, this is a requirement, right? I mean, when someone becomes the new Sorcerer Supreme, like if Doctor Strange relinquishes that role, if he says, I hereby retire and I grant you the mantle of Sorcerer Supreme, a brunt of all that magic goes with it. Doctor Strange can still access a few things, but he's nowhere near on the same level as Loki, who's already adept in magic and then has all the Sorcerer Supreme artifacts and power at his disposal. But with Doctor Strange here using the power of Yggdrasil and amplifying all of his magical energy and knowledge, he is well beyond Loki. And it's actually pretty cool because these two fighting actually starts transversing these different dimensions. It's almost like a throwback to Secret Wars 2 when Molecule Man and Beyonder fought each other, and it was just sending shockwaves throughout the multiverse because the battle was so extreme and so intense. But probably the craziest display of power here, and this is something that no magic wielder that I'm aware of has ever done, when Doctor Strange and Loki are teleported to what's essentially a hell dimension, because there's a lot of dimensions that are basically like hell in Marvel Comics. Doctor Strange, using the power of Yggdrasil, like rematerializes the entire dimension. Like, he literally transforms the whole thing, and it's nuts. Like, he turns the demons into like little furry bunnies, which are adorable. Like all these insane things. And so again, it's a wild level of power. But the response of Loki is, you have a mortal form. You will die one day of old age. Like, what you're doing here is going to require an insane price. And this is when we find out Robert Reynolds is the one paying the price for this. Because he's so powerful, because he really is on the level of a god, he's just, more or less taking in the price, quote unquote, that has to be paid for all the power that Doctor Strange is using. using. And so in the midst of all this, because you have Stephen Strange and you have Loki who are facing off against each other, Zelma actually just kind of happens to be wandering by because, you know, coming back from the store, I guess. Anyway, she shows up, basically casts a spell that nullifies powers for 3 minutes. And so this essentially leads into her kind of saying, hey, look, you guys need to talk it out. And of course, Loki, still having the power of a god, kind of gets the upper hand. Now, this is when things get awesome because the response of Stephen Strange, you know, when Loki says, open the door, like I want this spell, open the door. Strange says, okay, look, like I'll open it, man. Just be aware that like whatever happens next is on you. And the reason why is because as soon as the door is opened by Doctor Strange, a kind of darkness begins to ooze out. And this is when we find out that it's actually the Void. And it's the craziest thing because Loki's scared out of his wits, right? Like he's just like, oh my God. And this is crazy because he gets knocked out of the building, right? It's just like, bam, he goes flying out of the building. Zelma comes over, oh, Loki, what's wrong, Loki? Hey, and he's like, dude, we have to run. We need to get out of this place. And the reason why is because the Void is here. And it's kind of crazy because remember, the Void killed Loki. Like that's what happened during Siege on Asgard. Robert Reynolds destroyed Asgard, lost control, the Void emerged and killed Loki on the spot. I mean, it was just like, bam, like it was drapes, curtains. It was Loki, the god of mischief and dying at the hands of the Void. Like it was pretty beast. Now, of course, at this point, like what you end up having is the Void who's kind of like pushed out of Stephen Strange's body, right? Like using the various magics available to Zelma and Loki. Strange is essentially freed, but he really doesn't like have any of that power left, right? Like all that power is basically gone. And this is when we find out the spell of the exile of Sing Soon is a spell that will actually revitalize magic, more or less. At least that seems to be the case. And that's what's kind of crazy is because magic is, you know, seems to have been dead, but like this spell basically brings it all back. Now, in truth, this is Donny Cates' way of setting things back to rights, right? Like you had like Jason Aaron's run, magic was dead. Donny Cates brings it back. Let's go forward with Doctor Strange. That's really how this whole thing works. And so everybody who was at their, you know, who lost their magical abilities, they're amplified back to where they were before. So this is kind of a way to fix everything that was going on with like Ileana Rasputin and with Scarlet Witch. Now, whether other writers follow suit, we don't really know because in Marvel Comics, the left hand doesn't really know what the right hand's doing. But still, like with regards to these guys facing off against the Void, remember, you're talking about an insane level of power. The Void is extreme in its abilities. And so when it comes to like Loki and you know, Doctor Strange, even with all their powers, it's still one hell of a fight. And it takes all three of them plus Robert Reynolds to push the Void back into this, you know, giant vault more or less, and for the door to be sealed. The fight doesn't last that long, but it does serve its purpose. The Void is essentially exiled again, it's locked back up, and then Robert Reynolds freaks. And the reason why is because this is what was done. That when you had Robert Reynolds as the Void, Doctor Strange had split the two. But the response of Reynolds is, you let the Void out. Like, I don't understand why you let the Void out. The Void will destroy everything, which it will. It would annihilate everything. Like we saw that in Siege on Asgard, the what if story. It's an extreme level of power. But what you ended up having here is Reynolds who kind of says, look, do not talk to me again. Now, of course, this will probably segue into Jeff Lemire's Century Solo series. So kind of have your eye out for that. It comes out at the end of June on the 27th. So this probably segues directly into that, either showing us what was going on before this story picked up with Reynolds or what's going to happen after all this. But then what we also end up finding out here is, you know, Zelma kind of tells Loki, look, tell the truth. Like if you don't tell the truth, then I'll tell Stephen Strange. And so we end up finding out here that Loki had cast the entire tournament as an illusion, right? Like there was no tournament. Like using his magic, he tricked Doctor Strange into believing the Vishanti had created a tournament and said the winner of this tournament will become the new Sorcerer Supreme. Stephen Strange had kind of won, but then was stripped of his power, or at least was told by the Vishanti a new Sorcerer Supreme would be chosen. And the result was that Doctor Strange, under false pretenses, relinquished all of his power to Loki. Now, on the surface, the idea seems to be that Loki's doing this for the sake of just being a bad guy, right? You know, it's like, well, it's what Loki does. You know, he tricks Sorcerer Supremes into giving him his power and then kind of runs amok and screws things up a little bit. You know, it's kind of how it goes. But what Loki actually does is he makes a really compelling case here. He essentially says to Doctor Strange, a race of people showed up on Earth, killed magic, and there was nothing you could do to stop them. There was nothing you could do to defeat these guys. Now, they were just regular beings. Like, I could have destroyed them. Because you're a good guy and because you want to do the right thing and so on and so forth, that's your weakness. Loki's whole idea here is there is evil out there. There are events out there that you are woefully unaware of. And there are things that are coming to Earth that are going to turn everything you know and love upside down. The War of Realms, the whole like damnation of Earth, the gathering of the Infinity Stones, and of course, the final host of the Celestials. Woe betide Doctor Strange when that happens, because it's like, you're not ready. I mean, you're talking about cosmic gods, Celestials coming back for a final host. You couldn't defeat a race of beings who wanted to, or at least you couldn't immediately stop a race of beings from destroying magic. How in the heck are you going to stand any chance against cosmic beings with the power, with powers well beyond your ability to comprehend? And so ultimately, you know, it's like, I did this in order to teach you how much you don't know, in order to teach you how, in order to show you that without magic, you are painfully incapable. Like, you are completely inept if you do not have magic at your disposal. disposal. If you're going to win these conflicts, you have to be more than just a guy who uses magic. So it's actually a pretty important lesson that Loki's teaching here. He kind of offers a few explanations here and there, whatever, and then ultimately Doctor Strange says, fine, give me my cloak and get out of here, sends Loki to a hell dimension. Following this, Zelma quits. And again, this is Donny Cates kind of setting everything back to just standard Doctor Strange stories where it's just Stephen Strange by himself. But again, kind of a reshuffling, a reworking of things. This will go forward into Marvel's Fresh Start or whatever in the heck they're calling it, and it'll just be it'll just be Doctor Stephen Strange by himself. But still, it's a pretty solid story. It's a pretty cool way to kind of set things back to rights and sort of eliminate, or I guess really remove a lot of the things that Jason Aaron did that I guess Marvel didn't really like that much. I have no idea. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.